Good afternoon. Looks like we're still waiting on a few others to join. We'll get started in just another minute. Thanks. All right, it's 12:05, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome again to everyone who's been on for the last 5 minutes. You're here for the Climate Justice Working Group meeting. We have a very full agenda today for this 3-hour meeting. So Alana, will you go ahead and move us to the third slide? Go ahead and get started. Great, so we'll start with a roll call for the working group members. Do we have Elizabeth on?
Hi, everyone. Present, Elizabeth.
Hello. And Amy Klein.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Good afternoon. Mary Beth.
Good morning.
Oh, good afternoon. Sorry. Hope everyone's well.
And Abigail.
Hi, glad to be here.
And do we have Sonal?
Present.
Next, Jared.
Yep, here. Good afternoon. Hope folks are doing well.
And Jonathan. How about Neil?
Yep. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's Neil.
And Joe?
Hello, everybody. This is Joe.
And Chris from NYSERDA?
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the double muting.
And how about Eddie? Just double check the other list. Okay, and Rawa. All right, well, as they join later, we'll ask them to introduce themselves. We also have with us today Alana Cadell-Tucky from the DEC Environmental Justice Office, and I'm Rosa Mendez, also from the DEC Environmental Justice Office. And today we have with us from Illume, our consultants. Will you say a little hello, Alex and Amanda?
Hi, this is Alex Dunn from Illume.
Hi, this is Amanda Dwelly from Illume.
And last week, we introduced Samir. Samir, do you want to give a hello today?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody.
Great, thanks, Samir. And we also have a couple of other people on from DEC today, including Jared Snyder and Maureen Letty. But let's move on so we can take a look at our agenda for today. Great, so today we're gonna cover a few business items, and then Chris Cole is gonna walk through a discussion on investments and benefits, and we have a scheduled 10-minute break before we go into a discussion on the advisory panels and the recommendations process, and we'll end with a 30-minute discussion, sort of instructions and a preview of the scenarios that Illum has been putting together for us. So let's go to the next slide. We'll get to our business items. The ground truthing request, thank you very much. We just received 2 more this morning right before the meeting, so thank you all for your attention to that. And if you still want some assistance with that, happy to provide that, and looking forward to receiving everyone's responses. We had our last meeting on April 21st, and at that meeting, we introduced Samir to the group, and we also took a deep dive into our timeline and walked through the decision path that this working group is going to go through for their efforts. And then we had a little bit of a discussion, sort of a preview on the scenarios and what would be included in those. Does anyone have any comments on the 421 meeting? Any reflections?
Rosa?
Okay, great. And now just, I see that Eddie has joined us. Hi, Eddie.
Hey, good morning. Oh, afternoon, sorry. A quick question. Were the minutes circulated? I didn't see those, and I don't know if that's an item or that's the next item on the agenda, or is that what we're doing now?
They were circulated, and I was just about to ask if anyone had any edits that they have not yet sent to me for those minutes, or if anyone wanted to open a motion to approve the minutes as written so we can move them into final.
Rosa, I don't know if anyone else had this problem. I didn't see a minute, I didn't see a draft minute circulated. I did see the ground truthing Tableau guidance. I don't know if everyone else has seen it, then never mind, but I don't know if anyone else had the same problem. I just didn't see minutes from the meeting.
Sure, let me just check. They were sent by email, and they're also in the folder for the materials for today. But if we're all having trouble accessing that, we can table the vote until you've had a second to review those minutes.
They were attached to the email that we received for today's meeting.
Yeah, I saw them as well as an attachment.
So Eddie, I'll make sure that I send you another copy of those. But for today, does anyone want to open a motion to approve those minutes?
Yeah, I'll motion to approve the meeting minutes from April 21st.
Great, thanks. A second?
A second.
Thank you. And so we can do a show of votes like we've been doing. If you could scroll over to underneath where you see all your names, there's a button that looks like a megaphone that says feedback. You can use that to push the yes button for yes or the no button for no. And that way I can record all your votes. They don't have enough yeses to pass the motion.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again? I
Sure, no
apologize.
problem. And you
We've done
can-
this before and I keep forgetting. Where button do I
It's
go to?
So underneath where you see all the participant names, there's a little button that looks like a megaphone.
Ah,
It's the feedback button. Yep.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now we have enough votes to pass, and we'll move those minutes as final. Great. And the next item on this list, also something that we sent around, it was kind of large, so I sent the link to your SharePoint. It's the background document on, we're calling it the scoring background document. So it shows the indicators that we put together and how they were run through the evaluation rubric that we put together. So it has all of that background information. Were there any questions on that? Any thoughts on that document if you've had a chance to look at it? I'm not seeing any hands, but if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to Chris or I. Happy to walk through it.
That I'm looking at the right thing, the one called Draft Disadvantaged Community Scoring Approach.
Yes.
Okay. My feedback is, wow, lots of information, but thank you for the.
Yes, it is, and that's why please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or any thoughts on that document, if we can try to make it simpler or something. But we want it to be thorough so that everything from our meetings was recorded within that document.
Rosa?
Yeah.
So sorry, this document you're talking about, was that in the last email that you sent that was highlighted as pre-read materials?
That might have been how I phrased it, because that
Gotcha.
email also included all the stuff about the panels. Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, the reason, and I remember why I was having trouble, and then I for some reason when I click on the pre-read materials, when I click on it, it wasn't taking me anywhere. So that was, and when I tried, I just never got back to this email. So I'll, but it's all on the archive, right? Like I can find.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Great, and I'll send everything around again. This way, you have the links in front of you as well.
Thank you.
Rosa,
And just a reminder that, oh, go ahead. Heard someone.
yeah, sorry, it's just a question about that document, the scoring background document. Is that in the May 12th folder? Is that where it's located at now?
It's in that folder, and it's also in the resources folder. So
Okay.
I put it in two places in case you were jumping around looking for all the materials.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Then I'll say good afternoon to Rawa, who joined.
Good afternoon, everyone. And actually where I'm at, it's good morning, but it's great to be here with you.
Thanks. Okay, and next up, our meeting on May 24th is the next meeting. And I wanted to ask Jared Snyder to jump in for a second, because at that meeting, he would like some time with you all to talk about the community air monitoring. So Jared, do you want to give a few minutes of a description?
Sure, just very briefly, and good afternoon, everyone. So the CLCPA requires us to implement a community air monitoring program in at least 4 priority disadvantaged communities. And so we have started thinking about how to do that. The law doesn't require us to implement that until October 2022. But we're getting a head start on it, and would be interested in getting started before that deadline, if at all possible. So, the law also requires us to get input from the Climate Justice Working Group in putting that together. Given that you're developing the criteria for identifying disadvantaged communities, it's important that we hear from this group, how to prioritize disadvantaged communities. But we're also interested in your thoughts about what is the best type of approach to air monitoring to use. So that's what we'll be talking about briefly at the next meeting. I think, I'll maybe do a 5 to 10 minute presentation and then get everyone's input. And we're setting up some separate conversations as well with various organizations.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, why don't we move forward, Alana? All right, and next I'm going to turn this over to Chris Cole, who's going to walk us through some preliminary thoughts on investments and benefits. Chris?
Thanks, Rosa. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. So I know this is a topic that we've all kind of flagged as being, crucial and interdependent to the work that we've been doing for the last several months to identify what the criteria should be for, defining communities that would be disadvantaged under the law. So we wanted to make sure that we dedicated time to this meeting today to start the conversation with the working group on what the state team has been doing in terms of kind of scoping out the investment and benefit considerations. Get some initial kind of reactions today, but then obviously we'll be planning on continuing the conversation to kind of finalize what this looks like. We're hoping that the conversation today can help us, better contextualize how the various components of our work streams all fit together. So whether that's, landing on the final set of criteria for a disadvantaged community, or ultimately understanding kind of how the investments and benefits would flow into those communities. Alana, if you wouldn't mind maybe going to the next slide. So what we wanted to do was have more of a discussion, right? So I do have a number of slides to kind of to walk through with everybody, but I want to make sure we take the time to kind of talk through kind of the concepts and the thinking related to kind of each of the main components here. And like I said, we're hoping today to get some initial reaction. We know that this may be the first time that, some of you are kind of hearing this. So the idea is, let's start to socialize this work now. But then, obviously over the next several meetings, we'll want to make sure we're kind of picking back up on various kind of elements of this work as we look to finalize this in parallel. I think that's the other thing that's been important, is important to just acknowledge is, we've unfortunately had to parallel track a lot of this work, just given the fact that we want to be in a position where we get a final set of draft criteria at some point soon, so that way we can kind of go forward with the public comment process and ultimately let that get through that 3-month process and get to a point where we have a set of communities that we're identifying, which will then, as we'll talk about in the next hour or so, we'll be better able to understand like how the decisions on investments and ultimately those benefits will kind of be able to be directed at these communities. So Alana, if you want to mind going to the next slide, please. And so, I guess I'll also just say, the DEC team, the ILLUME team, we've all spent a lot of time thinking about this in addition to the other work we're doing as a working group, so feel free to jump in along the way as well. But we thought it'd be good to kind of just start with a refresh on the investment mandate or the investment and benefits requirements of the law. I think we're all fully familiar and aware of what is being asked of the state to do or requiring the state to do, but essentially, calling for communities that this working group identifies to be disadvantaged to receive 40% of the benefits associated with the clean energy or energy efficiency investments across a number of different funding areas. So whether that's workforce development, pollution reduction, housing, low-income energy assistance, transportation, economic development, there are a number of state portfolios that are focused on these different funding or investment areas, and we're being asked to look at how we can direct those portfolios. So at a minimum, 35% of the benefits of the investments that are being made are kind of being realized by those communities. But our goal here is at least 40% of those benefits going to the communities that we're focused on. We'll talk a little bit more about the benefits versus investments, issue. I know that's come up in the past, kind of a bit of a complicating factor as we start to think about, how do we think about tangible benefits to communities, and what does that mean when we're thinking about investments in a number of different, program or funding areas, and trying to align on a consistent set of benefits that we could be looking at. So, so with that kind of level set, Alana, could you go to the next slide, please? Excuse me. So there's several work streams that are currently underway, and there's a state team comprised of NYSERDA, DEC, the Department of Public Service, and to a lesser extent, a number of other agencies and state entities have been involved in, helping us think through what their portfolios look like. But we've started, several months ago to work with the various agencies that are, that have programs or investments related to the law, and we're trying to better understand, what are those investments, pulling together an inventory of those, trying to understand the nature of those investments and some characteristics, such as, what's available in terms of level of detail. Like, can we actually localize these investments? Are they going to a specific address, or are they more focused on, more statewide or systems-wide benefits or outcomes? We're also having to understand how agencies are, measuring and tracking and reporting, benefits, today. So what are the systems that they use, and how do we think about being able to develop, a platform for consistently reporting or tracking and reporting on these investments and benefits. And most recently, over the last couple of months, we've focused exclusively on the agencies or authorities that are more directly focused on energy in the state. So that's the NYPA, LIPA, DPS, and NYSERDA portfolios. So our assumption, in this inventory of investments that is underway, will ultimately, inform this. But our operating assumption, right now is the bulk of the resources that would be, driven to disadvantaged communities would likely come through these, energy-focused portfolios. So we're really spending the time now with each of these portfolios to better understand kind of, historically, what have those investments and those portfolios done? Where are we today, and what do we need to do in order to kind of bring them into this, this framework of, directing investments and benefits to disadvantaged communities, and ultimately how we report on those. And we'll talk a little bit more about the work involved there in a little bit. There's also a state staff working group that's been set up as well to kind of parallel the work that is happening amongst this kind of smaller state team that's developing the initial thinking on the investments and benefits to help us better kind of understand kind of which agencies, you know, we need to spend the most time with in terms of their systems capabilities, their capacity, and also just order of magnitude in terms of level of resources that they would have, you know, to be considering, you know, directing. And we've landed on what we want to share and discuss today is we've identified an initial set of benefit metrics that we can track today, but you know, knowing that we'll have to, you know, really think about how best to kind of develop that, you know, over the next, you know, year or so. So we're really thinking about a phased approach here, but we'll think about that together. And then, as I mentioned a few times already, like we're really focused on not only the substance on the investments and the benefits, but you know, the systems, right? Because we really need to make sure that we're, you know, providing transparency into what's happening when it comes to investments and the benefits or outcomes that are tied to those investments. And, you know, we need to make sure that we have the ability for the, you know, for this group to be able to pull together kind of like a public facing dashboard that provides, you know, the insights necessary to track compliance with the law. Alana, do you want to go to the next slide? And I guess, you know, working group members, feel free to jump in with any questions or any comments along the way. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat function as well. Hey, Eddie, go ahead.
Hey, Chris, how are you? Listen, quick question. Some of us have been curious about the exact wording of investment and benefits, and thanks so much for refreshing our collective memory by slide 8. I don't know if it's possible to go back to it, but part of what we've been wondering is the language that appears to assign the 35 to 40% goal beyond just energy investment. Like if you look at the fourth line, this is overall benefits of spending on clean energy efficiency programs, projects, or investments in the areas of housing, workforce development, and economic development. Like it appears to capture a broader set of investment commitments than purely energy. So I'm not sure if you all have had any conversations internally and how you all are processing that, because there could be a difference in magnitude of the kinds of monies that we're trying to capture. So I'm just wondering where you all land. And I saw that in the next slide, 9, you talk about you're right now assessing the energy focused portfolios, but I'm just wondering if you all have had a conversation about the potential for this to actually include other broader buckets of funding.
Yep. Yeah, Eddie. So the way that we've been thinking about the way that this is framed is, you know, starting with the initial screen of, you know, is it clean energy or energy efficiency? If so, you know, we count it. And then we look, you know, in those other funding areas. So let's look at the housing portfolio, you know, look at the resources that are going to clean energy or energy efficiency outcomes. You know, we should count those, transportation, you know, so on and so forth. So, you know, the inventory that we're doing, we started with, you know, probably, you know, 12 to 15 agencies to understand kind of what their portfolios and what their investments look like. We did this early on, and there's a lot of ambiguity, you know, and a lot of, you know, uncertainty that agencies had, you know, like, does this count or does this not count? And so, you know, what we've kind of realized is we need to do, you know, a lot of one-on-one, you know, kind of assessment with those agencies. And so the reason that we've focused initially on, you know, the NYSERDA, LIPA, NYPA, DPS, which would also be the investor and utility portfolios, is, you know, we know without a doubt that those, those portfolios are definitely included, and we want to make sure we're kind of, understanding the nature of all of those investments first. And the idea here is to kind of branch out and address all of those other, funding or focus areas as well.
Gotcha. Oh, can we go back to 8 for just a second? Slide 8. That fourth line, overall benefits of spending on clean energy, energy efficiency programs, projects, or investments in the areas of housing. So I'm just wondering, Chris, reasonable people could disagree and infer that this is energy efficiency investments or investments broadly speaking in housing, workforce development. Like it's not just the lens of clean energy. I'm not advocating, but I'm just saying that this the ambiguity that you just mentioned is right here in black and white, and it makes sense for you all to begin with the energy investments. But I also want you, I want you all to take back that a person can infer that this speaks to beyond just energy or energy efficiency. It could speak to investments in housing overall, workforce development overall. Like that is, frankly, some of us were happy to see this change because this was not what was in the original bill. And maybe in the editing, when we went from a clear investment to the squishier benefits language, some sloppy editing of the bill actually expanded the potential scope of investment programs that 35 to 40% could be applied to. So that could be, again, I just want you all to give some real serious conversation internally among the agencies, because this could be a difference literally of billions of dollars if between just energy and the potential for much broader applicability of this. So thank you.
So Chris, if I may,
Yeah,
okay, sorry.
Yep, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
I was just gonna agree with Eddie and say that, from a climate justice perspective, when we think about the investments, we're thinking about a just transition, about deep energy democracy, which is community ownership. And we're thinking about food sovereignty, and we're also thinking about a just recovery and what that means. And some of the things that have been popping up, at least in our community recently, is some inconsistencies that exist, like businesses wanting to bring in some C&D, bringing in more truck traffic. I think that part of trying to move towards addressing these problems is also looking at what internal inconsistencies exist at DEC and at the agencies, where you are literally when I think about Biden investing in Justice 40, but at the same time doubling down on fossil fuel investments, it's like we're giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And so for this to actually have traction and long-term benefits, and for us to experience a change in the culture of practice of the state in terms of addressing climate justice, it also means that y'all are going to have to engage in an internal assessment about where your own rules and regs and permitting prevent us from using these investments as a way to take us to where we are all collectively trying to get to. So I just want to say that I don't know if that's part of the charge, and it may not be, but it almost is something that has to be included. Where are the inconsistencies? How are we harming communities at the same time while talking about how we are moving investments? And also the last thing I'd say is there needs to be clarity, very specific clarity on the difference between benefits and investments. There needs to be very specific language that speaks to that. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth and Eddie. So points taken. The interpretation that the state has made was is kind of the clean energy focus, but point taken that we need to kind of go back and and have these discussions and clarify. So
can I just add one thing?
We want to.
Sorry,
Sure.
Chris Stroh, I had a question.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I didn't see you. Okay.
Okay. As the state agencies are having these conversations, how are you thinking about how you're going to be communicating with frontline communities in particular, or disadvantaged communities, to make sure that even as those top-down decisions, again, all intentions are so great, but what kind of impact will it actually have is how are communities deciding for themselves what it is that they want and need around this very broad sort of investments and whatever the benefits are going to be. I also really wanted to lift up everything that Elizabeth and Eddie said. It was exactly what I was thinking in my head. But I think the other important piece is oftentimes, and I think it goes speaks to what Elizabeth was saying, is that just bringing in some of these larger corporations or opportunities for financing and what have you. If the actual community residents that live in those neighborhoods can't take advantage of them or can't really access them because they're not designed in a way that they're able to, then the benefits are not going to be there. And then I think the other question that I always have is how and when, like what kind of timeline will be created to track the benefits that are occurring in these communities.
Thanks, Raul. There's,
I'm sorry. I just want to add one more thing to what Raul said. I'm sorry. If I may, I'm sorry. I also am really concerned about making sure that as we are making resources available, you know what happens when resources become available? It becomes a nonprofit feeding frenzy with the nonprofit industrial complex, the empire builders are really sort of lining up to take advantage of the resources available. So my concern is really about how we level the playing field and how the investments are made against a baseline, literally of decades of massive underinvestment in our communities. So I want to make sure that we're really clear about prioritizing communities and supporting anchor organizations that have been doing the work around climate justice, because otherwise we're going to be in the same situation. And so I wanted to add that. Sorry, we keep interrupting you, Chris.
No. I mean, so this was the intent, right? We wanted to have these conversations, or this conversation now. But I think the one thing, just I want to remind everyone, this is a monumental shift, right, for kind of the way that the state has done business as usual. So, I think what you're seeing is, the initial kind of set of work that, that I'm going to be speaking about is really us trying to understand, where are we and how do we kind of, get to where we want to go. I think, Raul, your points about, how are we engaging with the community? How are we, and Elizabeth, to your point, like, how are we ensuring that, what we're doing is actually what the community wants, and, and we're advancing kind of opportunities for the community is got to be part of this. And so we'll talk a little bit more about, kind of what we've been thinking about in terms of, needing to make sure that there's kind of engagement along the way, and we're kind of investing in kind of, capacity building and other kind of, supports to communities, and also kind of acknowledging that, this is not going to happen overnight. So how do we put this on a path where, we can, get the outcomes and really put communities in a position where we want them to be. So, maybe we can continue to kind of talk through the initial thinking I want to share with everyone, and we can continue to kind of identify where you all either have questions or issues that we need to work through, because it's really helpful for us to kind of hear that and be able to have this initial conversation, which we can then have a follow back up on next time we engage. Excuse me. Alana, could you go to, where do we leave off? Slide 10, maybe? Or maybe 11? Okay, yep, this one, yep. So, nope, I'm sorry. Slide 10, yep, perfect. So in terms of investments, thinking about, what do we count and, how do we count it? One of the things that we've, thought that we need to make sure we're distinguishing is kind of the investments that, are and can be directed to, a locality or to kind of specific projects versus investments that would really be made towards infrastructure or, systems-wide, benefits or outcomes. So thinking about like transmission and distribution or large-scale renewables. So kind of our initial thinking is, we would count the investments that are being made, to projects and localities, as part of our, 40% tracking. But then, we would look to identify additional benefits and outcomes that are meaningful, that can be associated and tied back to these broader investments, and, report out on those and track those kind of parallel with kind of like the 40% accounting. I guess a real world example would be, I think if we're talking about, large scale renewable investments, in a lot of cases, there may be projects that are being cited because there's like a systems need, in a certain area. And so, they may not be located near, a community that we're identifying as disadvantaged. So, how do we tie kind of those investments or benefits back to a specific community? There's probably, broader investments, or I'm sorry, benefits that we would be accruing, that would kind of, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions reductions or kind of like higher level benefits that, society as a whole is enjoying. So there's kind of some incongruence with, benefits that are accruing at that level and at the community level. So we want to kind of make that distinction. We also, we've talked a little bit about this as a working group, and, we think it needs some additional conversation and ultimately, land on a place where, where do we think about investments that are being made to benefit certain individuals versus communities? So whether that is like low-income households or priority populations that we would be targeting for like workforce, development and training opportunities. There's in some states, we saw California kind of adding a layer or kind of an add-in for, programs or investments that are targeting individuals. We want to think about what that, how we approach that in New York and, how we're kind of accounting for, some of those investments or benefits that are going to those individuals. Any thoughts on that? Eddie, go ahead.
Two quick things. First of all, thanks so much for the thinking more deeply about the difference between systems-wide or regional infrastructure investments, and that not serving as a backhanded way to get to the 40% goal. I really appreciate that. I know that I don't know about others, I think you and I have talked about the most obvious example is congestion pricing. We passed it in New York City. So, clearly the billions that'll, accrue from that should not be cynically boxed into the 40% for just our communities, but it's the entire city that's benefiting from these, right? So thank you for that. And yeah, I know that we've been trying to figure out the individual versus priority populations questions. I would say versus, I would say, finding ways of being more inclusive. One area that I don't know if you guys have started talking about, but came up when we had our meetings with our meeting with our colleagues from California, when it came to indigenous populations and tribes and the nations, where in California they were not, for a variety of just kind of historic reasons in terms of nation to nation considerations, they were not considered as part of the the disadvantaged community designation in California. But what they did do was develop a separate pot of money to make sure that indigenous communities would not be left behind. We still don't have any clarity about how New York State is going to engage with indigenous leaders and communities in the state. I would urge you all, as you're trying to figure, and frankly, it's way overdue. Like, we now have a law that's been 2 years, it's been a little less than 2 years it's been signed, with still no clarity for how New York State's going to engage with indigenous communities. So, if in fact New York intends on a similar approach to California, you all should also be talking about how to develop, a pot of money that will also be dedicated to indigenous communities in the state. So I'll stop there, but thank you for this.
Thanks, Eddie. Good points. And maybe we can follow up on the engagements of our indigenous populations later on this agenda or later on. I know there's been some conversation and some work at the state level on how best to engage. So I know that is happening. Alana, could you go to the next slide, please? So, we touched on this a little bit, previously, but, given that this is a shift, right, and there, as state agencies, as someone who works for a state entity, I can say, sometimes we're kind of, entrenched in kind of what we do. And this work that we're kind of undertaking is certainly, kind of requiring agencies and state entities to really kind of take a look at what they've been doing and kind of shift what they're doing in terms of their strategy and kind of deployment methods in order to kind of achieve the goals that we've outlined here. So, one of the things that the state team, the state staff team, and our consultants at Illum and some other partners have really been thinking about is, as we're engaging with other agencies on understanding their inventory of programs and portfolios, we're kind of also kind of flagging the need for us, while we're kind of understanding the nature of those investments, to kind of think about how best to shift what we're doing. So, and that might require, agencies to be, incorporating explicit kind of requirements for benefits or other, economic development outcomes for communities within procurements, whether it's RFPs or, kind of other funding opportunities that those agencies would be making. There's also kind of a need, and I think we've talked about this as a group here, at least in the early stages of the working group, a need to kind of improve engagement at the local level to better target outreach and ultimately remove barriers to participating in programs. And so that's another thing that, I know agencies are kind of thinking about right now. And then obviously we're going to need to think about, new initiatives, new kind of funding directed at communities in order to meet the needs that the communities have as we're really thinking about, building this more inclusive, we're just, transition into a clean energy economy. Just a flag, there's a couple of agencies at least who've started to make these shifts. Just because I work at NYSERDA, I'm not flagging NYSERDA for any special attention, but within the NYSERDA portfolio, there have been some shifts that have been made, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But then also at the DPS and the Public Service Commission, recent orders have kind of called, specifically for, initiatives and programs targeting, disadvantaged communities. So, this is kind of an early start, but, we're going to need to see, kind of this shift happen in several areas, funding areas across the state.
Hey, Chris.
Eddie, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, before you move on, to this end, I just want to make sure we flag this for you all. And this is actually a legacy request from the previous governor's EJ and Just Transition Working Group. A few years back, when we were talking about this, we specifically flagged the need to make sure that the regional economic development councils are accounted for in this process. There are 10 of them basically advising how the state should make, investment decisions by each region of New York State. And literally over the last few years, these regional economic development councils have approved literally billions of dollars of spending throughout the state. None of these councils, as far as I know, not a single one has a single environmental justice representative on them. Most, well, I'm not gonna say most, but the last time I checked, there was a diversity problem beyond EJ on these councils, and the fact that the councils, both by dint of their lack of diversity and any clear directives from New York State that their grant making has to prioritize these considerations, is also like a potential major loophole that we need to tighten up. So yeah, I just want to make the pitch for the REDCs to be brought into this process and made more accountable.
Chris, I have to leave. I have a conflict, but I want to add to, I'm really happy that Eddie raised that, because we had the same problem at the federal level with the FACAs, where all the EJ representation was in the NEJAC, and there were all these advisory councils that were made up of the Big Greens and other environmental organizations weighing in on issues that had an impact on our communities, but we were minoritized and placed into one advisory council where there were also industry representatives and academics. And so whatever bodies you have, including the one that Eddie just mentioned, the economic development one, that provides the governor or the state with advice on issues that have a disparate impact on our communities, whether they be social, educational, or economic, or particularly when there is a climate impact, they need to be integrated so that there is representation from the climate justice leadership. So I'll just leave that there, but Eddie is absolutely right. And so this is another example of there being a lack of consistency as we move forward. But anyway, thank you. And I'm sorry that I have to get off. When the other call is over, I'll come back on.
And Chris, just, third what was just said and reinforce that point. I think we've seen really disturbing just lack of understanding about climate issues and thought about it, from our economic development councils. So representation on those economic development councils would be a huge step forward. And related question, in the kind of assessment that you have all been doing of state entities and where investment dollars are going and kind of how to track this stuff and think about it, do you have a sense of what the current percentage is of investment that is going toward maybe, we don't have a DAC definition yet, but maybe the potential environmental justice areas and the DECs, or kind of your working definition that you guys have been using?
Yeah. Thanks, Abby. So we do, this is a bit of you're touching on a bit of the challenge that we face right now in terms of just having different levels of granularity when it comes to data on investments. So we do have this information for NYSERDA, which I'm sharing in a few minutes. So we'll be able to talk about that, but we could also talk about what we need to kind of put in place in order to kind of get to that assessment that you're kind of pointing to needing, which we agree we need to better understand where we are.
Thank you, Chris. And I look forward to seeing that NYSERDA number. And I guess I would just kind of reinforce again, I think our economic development councils need very clear guidance on what investment is, like what it means, what counts as. So like the more explicit you guys can kind of be as this rolls out, the better. So we're all on the same page.
Can I just ask a question though? With the REDC process, it seems like a lot of decisions are made before it even gets to the REDC. And, in looking through the guidelines that are put out, I'm wondering, and I don't know, it probably is too late for this year's round, but, what kind of thought has been put into the particular agency's guidelines that were put out, because, you know, that's how entities need to respond to these RFPs and, you know, be fulfilling different goals and strategies. I just throw that out there because that's the first stop, are the agencies.
Amy, so that's something we'll have to, at least I would have to look into. I can't speak to that right now, but good flag for us. Okay, any other comments or questions on content to date or so far? Okay, Alana, could we go to the next slide, please? So, yeah, as we're thinking about benefits, right? So we need to think about the benefits of the investments that are, you know, going in those funding areas, going to disadvantaged communities. There's a lot to consider, right? So namely how we can, you know, demonstrate achieving or surpassing the 40% goal. But we also need to think about how we develop a framework that could be applied to the various, you know, programs, you know, a diverse set of programs and investment areas. The staff team, you know, has done a lot of thinking with the Illum team, and, you know, we've come up with a few key considerations for how, you know, we want to think about benefits. And it'd be great to kind of get the reaction from the working group today on kind of the way we're thinking about this. So the first is, obviously, we have to be able to identify benefits that are tangible or meaningful to communities. You know, so it's one thing for us to track, you know, carbon emissions reductions, but it's another thing to track, you know, jobs within communities, right? We also, you know, given that this is, you know, this requirement is applied, you know, across multiple state agencies and portfolios, we're, you know, thinking about the need to make sure we're balancing the complexity, you know, so whether that's the cost or the time, you know, necessary to, you know, measure, track, and report benefits, you know, and obviously thinking about, you know, how we do that kind of at the local level. You know, so there definitely will be benefit metrics that we can directly measure, and we'll, you know, be able to more simply be able to track and account for them. But then there's other benefit metrics, you know, such as health outcomes, which I know, you know, this group in particular has been really focused on, you know, thinking about how we consider health in all that we're doing here, which may require, you know, longer term, you know, multi-year kind of evaluation studies. And so we want to make sure that we're kind of identifying metrics that kind of can strike the balance between, you know, things that we tracked now and we can kind of show progress on versus those that might take, you know, significantly longer in order to come up with a metric or an outcome that we could report out. Similarly, you know, we need to make sure we're getting information and identifying outcomes that we can use to manage these programs and investments. So, you know, while we might set up programs and systems to drive benefits a certain way, you know, obviously, you know, how that plays out, you know, may vary from region to region in the state, from community to community. So we want to make sure that we have some metrics that we can use to actually, you know, calibrate the programs or investments in order to make sure we are driving, you know, benefits to the communities. And then we also want to make sure that, you know, touched on this a few times here, but given that we're talking about, you know, investments across a number of different state entities, we need to make sure we have the ability to get granular levels of information on those investments. So that way we can kind of tie those back to benefits and to specific communities. So, you know, that's another kind of consideration that we need to make sure that we're not overlooking as we develop this framework out. Any thoughts on those? Anything you would add or question?
A quick question. In terms of localizing the benefits, and tracking that. Would that be like by census tract, kind of as we've been talking about with the DAC definition?
Yeah, so in terms of operationalizing this, and Amanda, you should feel free to weigh in too, since you spent a lot of time thinking about this. But as we're thinking about operationalizing kind of this framework, we are going to need to identify where the benefit or where the investment is occurring. So whether it's a building or some location within a community we could put an address to, so we could say, okay, that investment is happening kind of within this community, and whether that is kind of then evaluated kind of with the shape files or the census block groups that we ultimately wind up kind of using for the disadvantaged communities criteria. That's likely the way we would have to do it. But I don't know, Amanda, I saw your screen flash. Were you going to weigh in?
I think that was a good description. So just saying where each potential benefit metric occurs geographically, for some, programs like a heat pump or weatherization of a specific house, it's kind of it's easier to link that investment with that house and that census tract. But there might be other things like commercial solar where, it might, the project might occur in one place, but, financial beneficiaries might be in one place, and the beneficiaries of health benefits or air quality benefits might be in another place. So really looking kind of at each metric and at each type of investment to say, okay, where are, the beneficiaries, and are they really the address that is being tracked?
Thanks, Amanda. Rawa, I see your hand is up. Do you have anything you want to weigh in on, or was your hand up before?
That was my hand from before. I'll try to take it down. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I just saw it now. Okay, thanks, Amanda. Alana, could you go to the next slide, please? So we have some thoughts on kind of how to start kind of the benefits tracking. But we're thinking that we may have to take this in phases. Really starting with benefits or benefit metrics that we currently are tracking or can track or incorporate in the near term. And so one of the things that will allow us to do is try to address the kind of inconsistency in what the different agencies are measuring and reporting right now, and that we would kind of think about how to kind of add additional outcomes or investments, benefits that are not accounted for in the initial set of metrics in some sort of like supplemental report. So we haven't put together kind of like what this dashboard or reporting apparatus looks like yet, but kind of what we're thinking is we would be able to kind of show kind of progress on a number of different benefits metrics, and then kind of in addition to that, for investments that are being made in infrastructure, for instance, maybe there are certain specific benefits that we can require through those investments, such as local hiring, and we would have kind of a supplemental reporting of kind of those sorts of outcomes or benefits that are kind of driven through those programs or those investments. And then we would obviously kind of with this group, and then kind of with additional engagement with with communities and stakeholders, identify other benefit metrics that we should be tracking and reporting on. So really this is kind of somewhat driven by kind of a need to really start showing some progress now, but then also the reality that developing benefits metrics and accounting and measurement methodologies can be complex and time consuming. So we want to make sure that we're able to start this year showing progress here. And if there's no comments on this concept of phasing, maybe Alana, we can go to the next slide and we kind of talk about kind of what we're actually thinking in terms of the benefit metrics to be tracking. So as we're thinking about, you know, the way to start showing progress this year, you know, we've identified 6 benefit metric categories that we would track and report on. So spending, you know, jobs and training, participant bill savings, energy savings, air quality, and health as kind of the main categories. And we've identified several possible metrics that we would be able to track and report on. This is not an exhaustive list, but this, you know, this is kind of the best thinking that we have in terms of like, what can we do in the near term? And, you know, how do we, you know, start kind of showing progress this year, kind of acknowledging the fact that if we're including spending, you know, that's a large part of the benefits equation. So if we can kind of be able to kind of show kind of where investments are occurring, you know, a lot of these benefits and co-benefits will kind of, you know, drive from those investments. Any initial reaction to the benefit categories that we're identifying here?
I have a question, Chris.
Sure.
The 35 to 40%, is the success of that going to be assessed on an annual basis? And, or what's sort of the timeline for saying whether the goal has been achieved or not? And if in any given year or quarter or whatever that investment falls short, is there the expectation that it would be made up?
Yeah, so that, you know, obviously the law, the language in the CLCPA was silent on kind of, you know, what is the term here, you know. The way that the staff team, you know, we've been thinking about it is, you know, this is certainly a goal that we want to reach annually, but then there may be, by investment type or initiative type, there may be kind of multi-year kind of investments or, you know, stages until we kind of get the outcomes that we're trying to track. So it may look a little bit different by you know, program area or investment area, but that's part of what we want to make sure we're doing in setting up this like a reporting dashboard where we can track progress, you know, on an annual basis, and then kind of, you know, with this group and, you know, kind of through kind of, you know, additional, you know, engagements, you know, kind of, you know, think about how we could better calibrate and direct the programs in order to kind of achieve the goals, right? So I think it's a combination of, you know, shooting for kind of the goal every year, but then, you know, there may be some parts of the portfolio that we just can't measure on an annual basis, right? So we'll have to kind of take stock of the collective set of investments and kind of, you know, look at kind of where we're falling short and look at how we can, you know, make that up.
Hi, Chris, this is Sonal. I have some comments / questions about these metrics. I imagine these are just kind of like the sort of overarching idea, and there's more detail within these. One thing I'm interested in is for the bill savings / energy savings is around overall utility debt reduction. I think that's important to be tracking. And then also I'm wondering for things like job training, health, that we can specifically be really intentional about tracking those by race. So, you know, job training programs, jobs offered, and the demographic breakdown of that, you know, who kind of benefited from that. And then same for health impacts. So health impacts by race, by income, health impacts by race, by income of avoided transportation, and of, you know, all the different things. So I just think being really sort of explicit, sorry, about that will be really helpful to just be really good about tracking that from the start, because that will definitely be a question that I'm sure a lot of us will be asking when we see these metrics.
Thanks, Sonal. Yeah, so, point taken, and, we'll have to take that back. I do know we do have limitations in terms of, available data, especially, what's tracked and, the basis, like if we're using census or whatever, like how accurate, are some of those kind of more, granular kind of social demographic indicators. But we'll have to kind of think about how we can do something like that. I mean, it makes sense kind of to do this, but it's a question of how do we do it. So we'll have to take that back and think about methods. And so this is not your only time to give us a reaction and feedback on metrics, so, if folks don't have, any additional, thoughts that they want to share right now, we can kind of go to the next couple of slides and, circle back to kind of, benefit metrics. I mean, I think you'd all probably, want a little more time to think about this anyway before, signing off on.
The one thing, Chris, that I noticed there wasn't any sort of connection with was sort of either like health impacts related to food access or, something that sort of ties into that lens.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, and I guess admittedly, right, so the framing that we discussed at the outset, really kind of thinking about clean energy and energy efficiency as kind of like the primary kind of screens for the investments. A lot of kind of what we have listed here are really kind of driven by those sorts of clean energy and energy efficiency investments. And, so in historically, when you think about, how those sorts of investments can benefit a community, it's economic development opportunities through jobs, but then also, health impacts through reduction of fossil fuel, combustion at the local level, increased community engagement, and capacity building, so those sorts of benefits or impacts. But, to the point that Eddie made at the beginning, and Amy, that you're kind of reinforcing, we'll need to think about kind of additional metrics and kind of framing on this. Okay, Alana, would you mind advancing to the next slide? So here's kind of, our thinking in a nutshell in terms of how we kind of operationalize the, the tracking and reporting of benefits. So kind of this year, I mentioned a couple of times that we really want to begin to show progress in 2020. So we would establish a dashboard that would allow us to kind of track progress against the various, metrics or benefits, indicators that we identify. We'll begin tracking agency portfolios that have the most, relevance. In this case, the clean energy or energy agencies and portfolios to start with, that we would focus on programs or investments that are, place-based or where those investments can be localized. And, where we have the ability to kind of phase in benefits that are tied to kind of like these systems or statewide investments, that we would kind of incorporate those as we're able to. And then, as part of this, reporting dashboard, we would include some sort of a supplemental kind of report or analysis that would include additional outcomes related to climate justice or equity, kind of outcomes flowing through these these programs, that can't easily be rolled into the metrics that, we would be tracking. We also need to, solidify kind of the process to kind of, review progress, with the climate justice working group. So I know we've been really focused on getting draft criteria established, but that's something in the near future we want to kind of think about, like what is the engagement of the climate justice working group look like, over time. We would also look to start incorporating kind of this requirement that agency procurements incorporate provisions to deliver benefits to disadvantaged communities. So this is an area that might kind of also kind of tie into the points that Eddie and Elizabeth made earlier about also thinking about how we kind of work with the REDCs and other kind of decision-making bodies in the state to kind of ensure we're thinking about environmental and climate justice when decisions are being made. Excuse me. And then we would look to develop a way to aggregate benefits if we can, so again, like we're talking about in some cases some pretty disparate benefits metrics, but if we're able to aggregate them in a way that doesn't, kind of drown out the actual, metric we're trying to kind of demonstrate progress towards, we want to do that. Eddie, I see your frame is flashing. Did you want to jump in on this?
Oh, sorry. I just I don't know, and forgive me if I missed. It's obvious and I missed it, but there are like two key components to budgeting overall that I don't see here. How or what role is the division of budget playing on this, right? Like you've got, Mahika, you've got like, the people who are actually the folks that are overseeing the overall budget for the entire state. What and how is the budget division? How is the budget division? How is the second floor, processing this transition? Which it's really an incredibly useful, right, for the agencies to be talking about it. But the commitment would be even stronger if the agencies understood that the governor's budget office is going to be, this is a core part of what they're going to be considering as they pull together the overall budget every year. And how, for example, how are they incorporating this transition in negotiations, in the budget negotiations that happen between the governor's office, Assembly and State Senate. So and then you've got you've got the authorities budget office, right? So you've got authorities that are, we love you guys, right? But we want to make sure that a similar institutional incorporation is happening with the authorities as well. So I'm just curious, if you could just speak to or take a big step back or up and talk about how the budgeting is overall in the governor's office. How are they going to be incorporating or having this reality be reflected in their budgeting and negotiations and just overall budget leadership that they're going to be providing for the state?
Yeah, Eddie, so I can't speak to, how the governor's office is thinking about, kind of all of the aspects here, or kind of how DOB is. However, it's been made clear to, agencies that this is the law, and, we need to, kind of deliver and execute kind of to meet the law. So, so I know that has been, kind of expressed, and we'll have to have some, follow-ups, on kind of like, what this means in terms of, state budget. But, we're starting with kind of this process, because I think it was hard for everybody to understand just like where where the different agency investments were going, right? So we don't even know where we're starting, to be honest. So I think that is part of what, this work that we're doing now, as a staff team to just better understand the investments, and that should and will inform kind of the positions that, come out of the chamber, but I certainly don't speak for them. So more to come on that. But in terms of, kind of looking at this, like this approach, right? So we want to make sure we're starting, this year to be able to track progress. And then kind of as we kind of continue kind of rolling the implementation out, we would look to kind of include additional, agencies that we don't have included at the outset for whatever reason. And then we would look to kind of, establish, and implement a process for working with the state agencies for reviewing and calibrating their investments. So this would kind of be informed by the working group, but then other kind of stakeholder kind of engagement processes. But ultimately, we need to kind of develop this feedback loop that doesn't exist right now in terms of how, the investments are actually kind of accruing kind of within communities, and kind of thinking about how, strategically, the state can be kind of meeting those needs.
Chris? First off, I just want to, acknowledge and appreciate the focus on transparency here. I think with, this public facing dashboard that will be available, that's really encouraging to see. Also appreciate that there's the intention to keep this working group engaged in the process over the longer term, and kind of having some opportunities to weigh in. Wondering if there's also intention to do some public engagement kind of in this initial startup phase, specifically around like what should be included in the dashboard and how that can be structured to be most useful?
Yeah, and maybe that's something we can talk about as a working group. If any of you have any ideas on how we can best do that, in terms of engaging with kind of both end users, so who would be kind of, looking to leverage and utilize the information, but also, what does it mean for residents and communities as well, right? So, I mean, there are residents and communities who are interested in these outcomes, and so how do we make it kind of user-friendly? And it may be something that we also wind up having to kind of phase in, but it'd be good for us to kind of think about that as a group, and, we as a state team can give that more thought as well.
Chris, this is Sonal. So my understanding of the law is that the Environmental Justice Working Group is supposed to be established and working on CLCPA 40% overall. So I'm wondering if you've been thinking about, if you guys have been talking about how that group is going to be incorporated in this process, because that seems like exactly kind of up their alley in terms of intention.
Yeah. So I know the Environmental Justice Advisory Group hasn't formally been stood up yet. So we're kind of waiting for that to happen. But I believe that there's progress on that front happening now. So, I think once we're able to have that working group or the advisory group stood up, we can better kind of understand how to engage and work with that group.
Chris?
Andy?
To that point, I remember when both bills were being worked on, there was some language, and forgive me, I don't remember the exact wording of it. I don't know if it was in the EJ, I think it was in the EJ bill. I think that might have been passed after CLCPA, but there was some attempt in the legislation to provide some clarity or guidance about how the two groups would interact. I seem to remember that, given the sequence of how things were were rolling out, that that the EJ Advisory Board would be given the opportunity to comment on the product that comes out of the Climate Justice Working Group. I think it felt, if memory serves, it felt like more of an advisory role that they would be playing. But you know, one of the bills or one of the laws speaks to that kind of coordination. So to Sonal's point, I would urge you all to, you know, maybe for the next call, just have some clarity about how you all intend to, because the way things are going right now, it's completely possible that we will have, in fact, it's likely that we're going to have, you know, at least our disadvantaged working group recommendations, the investment, the benefits recommendations, like those big chunks of this group's work will be done before an EJ advisory board is even impaneled, right? So I don't think that I don't think that slows down what we're trying to get done. But Sonal's right. Like we need to be just clear about what that board's role is vis-a-vis the products that are emanating from this working group. Again, I think it's advisory, and I think that, but even still, it's yeah, it would be helpful for you all to come back to us with at least a sense of if, in fact, the advisory board gets impaneled after these products are out for public review. Will there be an opportunity for that advisory board to express its opinions?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie and Sonal. Yeah, let us regroup and add that to the agenda for the next meeting. And Rose, if you want to weigh in on that, but it sounds like that's probably the best approach here today is let's table that until the next meeting, and we can kind of continue on here. I know we're running short on time for this discussion, but maybe we can go to the next slide, Alana. And so for the group, what I wanted to do is.
Sorry, one
Abby, go ahead.
Last super quick thing about that. Just encouragement for, you know, to make it happen that these environmental justice folks could be compensated for their time. I know that was, you know, not possible for this working group, but, you know, I'm thinking about who in our community could do a really good job representing on that body. I can think of a couple people who'd be great, but they would need compensation.
Thanks, Abby. Okay, so I wanted to kind of, you know, give a kind of an example of what this this work that we're doing, right? You know, kind of starting with understanding where we are today, kind of thinking about how we're, you know, shifting kind of what we're doing, you know, is playing out, you know, and using NYSERDA as an example, because, you know, I'm closest to that work. But, you know, the thinking is, you know, we would apply a similar kind of approach where we can across the other kind of relevant agencies. But, you know, so Abby, you kind of teed this up earlier. In terms of baselining where we are, this table on the left provides a breakdown by the sectors within the NYSERDA market development portfolio. So these are the subsidy or incentive, you know, oriented programs that drive energy efficiency or clean energy adoption. We geocoded and mapped them against this interim definition of a disadvantaged community that, you know, we had put in place, you know, late last year. And so, you know, what this data represents is, you know, all of the data that we've been able to have geocoded since April 2016 to now, and just kind of showing kind of like by sector focus or market focus where, you know, those dollars are kind of going, you know, and so, you know, there's some intuitive kind of outcomes here. You know, our multifamily, you know, programs and our low and moderate income programs are, you know, kind of over 50% of the dollars are going into, you know, projects located in kind of these interim disadvantaged communities. Whereas, you know, kind of our 1 to 4 family home residential energy efficiency programs, you know, are not kind of driving, you know, as much or haven't been driving as much kind of uptake or expenditure kind of in these communities. So, this is a good starting point because we can understand kind of organically, how, program dollars have been accessed. But, ultimately, this we expect to look a lot different once we have, our final set of disadvantaged communities criteria in place. And, based on that, we'll be able to kind of really kind of assess the different program areas and, sector focuses and figure out how best to shift what we're doing at NYSERDA. But, what we're working on right now, and we started this, late last year, is kind of implementing kind of an internal kind of energy equity capacity building kind of focus. So really looking at how, across the NYSERDA teams and departments, we're really kind of focused on opportunities to kind of improve and enhance engagement of communities and stakeholders, and really kind of drive, looking for opportunities to drive the benefits of those program areas to those communities. And then there's a lot of work that's happening around kind of JEDI competencies, so justice, equity, diversion, and inclusion, across what NYSERDA is doing. And so, we're hoping that, this can provide a model for other agencies as we're thinking about how to, kind of orient and kind of shift program investments. There's new initiatives that, we're rolling out, and obviously this is just a start, but looking at ways to improve the performance, the energy performance of schools, especially those located within disadvantaged communities, looking at affordable housing opportunities, supporting capacity building for organizations that are representing disadvantaged communities or environmental justice communities, and also kind of supporting engagement in stakeholder process. So there's some work that NYSERDA is doing now to kind of flesh out like what's the programmatic, what does it look like programmatically for us to kind of offset the costs of engaging kind of with NYSERDA, and process and that sort of thing. And then, some of you are familiar with kind of this initiative that we're calling the Regional Clean Energy Hubs, which will come out in an RFP hopefully pretty soon. And the intention there is to really kind of, drive kind of access to programs and resources, increase engagement, and kind of build capacity within regions to kind of ensure that, disadvantaged communities are being positioned to benefit from the clean energy economy. So there's definitely kind of opportunity for us to kind of continue to kind of build out some initiatives that specifically target disadvantaged communities. But generally, there will be opportunities to kind of shift and optimize kind of existing strategies and programs to also deliver benefits. So part of what we're trying to do now is just, better understand where those opportunities are and execute on those. And the next slide, Alana, if you wouldn't mind, and I think I'll be done taking up time, but I want to make sure everyone has a chance to discuss, just to give people a sense of order of magnitude. So as I said, we haven't fully inventoried all of the relevant investments at this point, but to give you a sense for kind of like funding levels. So in December, NYSERDA petitioned the Public Service Commission to kind of shift some budgets within the NYSERDA portfolio, and kind of what I'm showing kind of on the screen is kind of the budgets for the market development portfolio. So between 2020 and 2025, so realizing this is we're a year into this, the budget was $1.5 billion, and the utilities have similar kind of budgets kind of going to their incentive programs as well over the same time period. So at least for that small set of program administrators, that gives you a sense of the budgets. Not represented here, like NYSERDA has an innovation department as well, that I think our budgets are somewhere around 500 million. So that gives you a sense of kind of order of magnitude, at least kind of within, these initial, just the NYSERDA focus. But then beyond that, obviously, we'll want to make sure we're looking at, the nature of the investments that the other agencies are making, and how much of those investments are controllable by the agency. Some agencies administer federal dollars that have specific, funding requirements tied to them, and in other cases, the state has more flexibility in administration. So those are also parts of the assessment that we need to undertake now. So let me stop there and open up for any additional comments or questions. We know we have more to cover on this topic, but I hope this is a helpful kind of at least start to the conversation for everyone.
Chris, this has been super helpful, and I know we're all like starting to wilt here and need a break, but one quick question about the previous slide. I just want to confirm my understanding that, if I could see the previous slide again, but I think I know what I'm going to say.
Alana, sorry, could you go back? Yeah.
That these numbers here reflect just the geographic location of the investment, not any sort of assessment as to who really benefited from it, right? So I'm looking particularly at industrial at 44%. I suspect that a lot of corporations really benefited from that money more than people living in communities. Would that be fair?
So this analysis represents where the money is going. When we're talking about industrial or commercial or even transportation, I think there are some of those benefits you could point to would be kind of reducing localized pollution, but the funding is actually going to these projects, right? Not to individuals. I think the only line item here that we could point to is like in the LMI budget line item. Those are all households, or affordable housing where residents are income eligible to receive kind of subsidized energy efficiency. So that's the only generalization I can make in terms of where the funding is going. But
all right, so thank you, Chris. I think we had scheduled in a 10-minute break, and we went a little bit over for this section. So how does everyone feel about taking a quick 5-minute break before we get into talking about the panel recommendations? All right, so we will reconvene at 1:45. Okay, coming back from our break. Samir, are you all set?
Hey, yep. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you. Great. And
Good.
Alana, if you can move us forward to the next, I think it's 2 more slides. Great.
Great. Hey, everyone.
All right.
I'm excited to go into the recommendations. We're really getting to a critical juncture in the process, and the thrust of this section is going to be to discuss your approach to sharing your feedback on the recommendations to the CAC, both collectively and individually. Next slide, please. So from the onset, I really want to make clear that I will be available to help all of you with tips, analysis, and other forms of help that you might need in making sure your perspective is heard by the CAC. And I know that everybody has busy schedules, so please note that I will also be willing to make myself available outside of regular work hours. And I hope that you've had the chance to look through the recommendations. I know they're very voluminous. I also provided a summary guide, a review guide, and a summary, which you could look at, and that also provides some tips on how you could look at the recommendations if you have limited time. And also there's a suggested climate justice lens that you could apply to reviewing the recs, and also some suggested strategies on how you could present your feedback to the Climate Action Council. There's a couple of other items that I wanted to cover before we get to the last slide, which is really the most crucial slide, and that's where we'll go over the different options for presenting feedback. But also, we'll just do a really quick high-level summary of the recommendations, go over the role, and we'll go ahead and skip the suggested timeline because we may not, or we'll skip the timeline and the suggested lens because we may not have time to go over that, but that's also in the document that you should have. Next slide, please. And well, we are going to skip this, but does anybody have any questions? Actually, let's just see. Does anybody have any questions about the timeline? If not, we can. Okay, yeah, let's go to the next slide. So just a reminder on your role. In addition to developing the criteria for disadvantaged communities, you have a consultation role in providing your input on the recommendations, which need to be considered by the panels, and you've already provided it to the panels. And now you'll be taking the final step of sharing that feedback with the council. You'll be reviewing recommendations from 8 total panels, and you should have gotten the first set of those recommendations a little while ago from Ag and Forestry, EITEs, Just Transition Working Group, and Waste. And then more recently, you should have gotten the slides from Energy Efficiency and Housing, Land Use and Local Government, Power Generation, and Transportation.
So Samir, just to note, those are still being uploaded to the SharePoint, so they should have them by the end of today.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to note is that when you're looking at the slide decks, if you have limited time, one thing I definitely recommend you do is just read through like the first part of it, which gives you the emission reduction projections, and it gives you a summary of every single recommendation. And then if there's one that like piques your interest, you can go look further at the elaboration of that. Okay, next slide. So one thing I really want to emphasize, before like really going into the review of the recs, is that while the recommendations are obviously the vehicle by which we will achieve the vision of the CLCPA, their ultimate success, it's going to depend on more than just the statutory language, obviously. These are three crucial areas kind of outside of the recommendations where we will have a role in really affecting kind of the quality of the outcomes that were intended by the CLCPA. You know, the first thing is the community air monitoring program. This is something that I'm in particular really excited about because this is going to provide the necessary hyper-local air pollution data to accurately measure air quality and to identify sources of pollution. And, you know, we're probably going to be, it's quite likely that we'll be working with many of you, and we can develop, as we, you know, take these measurements, we can develop more precise regulations and investment strategies to eliminate hotspots and, you know, ensure everybody in our state can breathe clean air. And whatever clean air policies might be included in the recommendations, like a carbon charge, a congestion fee, or various types of standards, we really, despite those things, we really won't be able to guarantee the success of reducing criteria pollutants as well as greenhouse gases unless we can successfully execute this program, which will have a significant role in. And then, of course, there's the criteria, the investments, and you know, your guidance, your recommendations on what that should be, as well as your input on defining the benefits and the work that we're going to collectively do to track those benefits and make adjustments as needed. That's also itself going to be a really crucial thing. And then kind of related, the third step is public oversight, which is, you know, that's going to be ongoing. And we will get the EJ advisory working group set up eventually. And that, and, you know, you with the climate justice working group and us all working together over the course of the implementation of the law and making corrections and making adjustments and seeing how things are. That's going to be also crucial to the success of this law. So just wanted to remind you of that. Next slide. We can skip this because this is just a suggested lens of how you could look at it, and that's also in the document. So I wanted to give a really brief, high-level summary of the recommendations. As you know, they're very extensive, so it's quite possible that, you know, crucial aspects aren't listed in like what you see on the slide there. One thing I also want to note is that it's the climate justice as a consideration was a directive to all of the panels. They were directed to factor in climate justice into what they recommended. And broadly speaking, I feel like they did. You know, I thought the breadth and depth of the recommendations was impressive. The recommendations, you know, they feel thoughtful, detailed, and I really think they have the potential to usher in transformative change and create a more equitable, just, compassionate, and unified society, which, you know, really are the necessary conditions of a just transition and making change at the scale that we have to. That said, I know that there are informed and reasonable disagreements over certain aspects, and I will be here to support and facilitate your constructive engagement to make sure that your concerns are heard and incorporated to the fullest extent possible. In each of the sectors where it's relevant, I provided the projection for how much greenhouse gases would be cut. And remember, the 2050 target that we're aiming for, that's to reduce GHGs 85% below 1990 levels by 2050, and then to offset the remaining 15% with in-state emission reduction projects. And as you can see, in some sectors, the emission cuts exceed 85%, and then in others, they're a little bit below it. I ran the aggregate numbers, and the target of bringing emissions to zero will approximately be met, you know, assuming all the assumptions are right, we will approximately meet that goal. However, according to the Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel, there's a little bit of an unknown in that we still need new solutions or new technologies to cut emissions in certain sets of buildings. And we need new technologies and equipment that releases certain high global warming pollutants. But assuming we can do that, I think we will get to that target, provided that these are the recommendations we move forward, and the assumptions are correct. Are there any clarifying questions here that I could answer or comments?
Hi, Samir. This is Joe McNerney with the Department of Labor. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more and elaborate on a component under Just Transition panel. It says, in part, to implement labor standards where possible. And I'm wondering, does that mean creating new labor standards? I'm wondering particularly about the where possible clause, how that applies.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it said, the whole thing said further evaluate, I believe it said evaluate the application of labor standards and implement them where possible. So generally, I'm just going to assume that there are not, labor standards affixed to every project that we're doing. And the way that I read this is in some cases, there may be legal hurdles to implementing labor standards in certain situations. Maybe if there's, if you're working with a business that's not, and the government has limited power. So in a circumstance like that, it's conceivable that we couldn't require labor standards. So I think that is what that meant. But, on the good side, that means that wherever it is currently legally possible, the labor standards would be implemented. And I'll have to follow up with you, on that just to make sure I described that correctly. But I think that's what it is.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Eddie?
Hi, and thanks for this, Samir. Can you all hear me? I'm getting some feedback. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you. So a couple of things. I'm a little disturbed about the how we're arriving at these emissions reduction target or percentages. Let me give you one specific example for transportation. There's an estimate that we would cut greenhouse gases by 77% below 90 levels. But one of the lead recommendations in that bullet is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which we have repeatedly, EJ groups in New York State, and I can't think of a single one that supports TCI, have been among the critiques is that there's no way to predict how TCI investments will actually be committed to transportation projects, as there is no protection against budgetary raids from that fund. So I don't know how much of that 77% reduction relies on TCI, but to the degree that it does, I can't see how anyone could honestly arrive at that percentage when we cannot protect those funds from rates. The other thing that I find troubling is that there have been reports that some of the working groups' recommendations are not reflecting either subgroups within those committees or recommendations that were pushed by some of the EJ advocates on these panels. For example, in the power generation, among the recommendations, we still see green hydrogen as a potential fuel source or energy generation source, despite the fact that in terms of studies that are out there, there is no dispute at the moment that the combustion of green hydrogen increases NOx emissions, which is clearly anti-climate justice and anti-environmental justice, that we would be considering a process that at least the peer-reviewed studies that have been out about this show that green hydrogen combustion increases NOx emissions. So I'm both worried about some of these numbers. I'm worried about some of the recommendations being potentially leading to disparate health impacts in EJ, CJ communities. And I'm also concerned about how much these working groups actually reflected the recommendations because, for example, going back to transportation, my understanding was that TCI was not the only mechanism that was being supported by the group, but potentially the Climate and Community Investment Act legislation that's in both houses. So I would urge everyone on this call to pay attention to, I think the Assembly's having a hearing exactly on the CLCPA implementation soon. Sorry, folks, I don't have the date in front of me. It may even be tomorrow. But I would urge the state to listen, because what's being promoted here as, clear consensus from these committees, I'm hearing that there is, in some cases, there was no consensus, or in fact, that, where there was a lack of consensus, that lack of consensus is not reflected in those recommendations. So I'm just passing along what I hear. You will hear this on the record in an Assembly hearing tomorrow, so don't take my word for it. But I have some problems with these recommendations and the numbers that are being attached to their greenhouse gas emission projections.
Thanks, Eddie. And if you have time, I would actually love to go dig into that, and I'll try to follow up and see about that. I'm sure there were dissenting opinions. Just to give you like a quick response, as you know, there may be limited applications of hydrogen. I don't know offhand how extensive useful applications of hydrogen. I don't know offhand how much that was, how extensive it was in there. And I would be quite surprised if they did include recommendations on the investments, since there's lots of unknowns there. And I hear your point about it, potentially being rated, and that would obviously be something that would need to be guarded against, and that would be something that, for whatever the source of the mechanism is, we would need to ensure that the revenue goes to where we want it to go. And in regards to the other point, like you mentioned, that other climate legislation which is out there, and it's my understanding that should there be, similar to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative or any other cap over any other sector, they could complement each other. So for example, if an entity has to buy an allowance spend $50 for an allowance under the cap, but then they owe a total $100 on the tax, then they just, then they pay the state the remaining 50 on that. That's one way it could work, but I would definitely, if you're interested, and I'd love to dive into that later to make sure that we address all of your points. And Jared, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Before Jared jumps in, just a quick response, Samir. I wasn't talking about cap and trade or that to trading mechanisms and those credits and how that might have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions. I was speaking specifically to TCI being flagged as one of the caps on GHGs, as the transportation bullet shows in this slide, but you don't, and you see CFS, but you don't see CCIA. So it seems to me that there was a thumb on the scale with that particular committee's recommendations, where they're calling out CCI but not CCIA, which I know was put forward by more than one person in that committee, and I believe was also raised at the Climate Action Council on Monday.
Got it. Thank you.
Hey, Eddie, it's Jared. I can just briefly respond to a couple of these things, and as a participant on the transportation panel, and I should point out, this is an attempt to summarize what is probably over 500 pages of slides across these advisory panels. So you're correct that one of the representatives on the panel preferred CCIA to TCI, and that is noted in the recommendation itself, as opposed to this really brief summary. So you can see that there. There were also a number of other market-based strategies that were identified. Things like congestion pricing in more locations, registration fees, things like that. So those details are in the more detailed recommendations. On the emission reductions for transportation, that's really driven by the zero emission vehicle standards for cars and trucks and the investments would support meeting those standards. But it's those standards themselves that accounted for the calculation of emission reductions from electrification. There's also emission reductions associated with the recommendation that doesn't really appear in this summary of greater availability and affordability of public transportation, greater access to public transportation, which also accounts for some of the emission reductions from the transportation sector. And then some portion is associated with lower carbon fuels as well.
Thanks, Jared. But just a couple of quick direct responses. So it's curious for me that out of 500 pages that came out of the Transportation Committee, somehow TCI lands on the very first line of this paragraph. So that communicates to me that there are some recommendations that are first among equals. Yeah. And the way this is written, a reasonable person would infer that the greenhouse gas emission reduction is in part attributable to a TCI program. Are you saying that none of the greenhouse gas emission reductions were calculated with TCI in mind? I just want to make sure because if that's the case, then TCI shouldn't even appear here as an emissions reduction strategy. Because one last thing, Samir, I don't know if you agree with this, but what has become an emerging EJ-CJ consensus nationally is that cap and trade as a market-based mechanism does not lead to greenhouse gas emission reductions. Not in EJ communities, but we have evidence in California, emissions have actually gone up. So let's be very clear that there is an affinity for market-based mechanisms among people on these panels. There are also people that have deep skepticism based on actual studies that show that market-based mechanisms are not emissions reduction strategies. And I got to tell y'all, if you keep trying to make that a thing, we're going to flag this every single time because where are the studies that show that? Anyway, I don't mean to go relive that debate with Jared, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding. The 77% reduction is not at all dependent on TCI revenue projections and driving those revenues to help reduce greenhouse gases? Or is
some portion of that calculation may be attributable to the effect of the cap, not the effect of the investments. The investments are supporting the other policies. For example, incentives for electric trucks, which would align with adopting the advanced clean truck rule, which requires the sale of electric trucks. And, frankly, we see a benefit to the investments. We can target the investments to make sure that those trucks are deployed in environmental justice communities where we, obviously, achieve a greater air quality benefit. When they're deployed in areas where there is high levels of pollution and high levels of traffic congestion.
Right. I think the problem is that if 77% reflects a projection that the TCI cap itself would lead to those, I have problems with that calculation. I would need to see the assumptions built into that modeling. I don't know. I think let me just speak for the people that I work with in EJ-CJ. Whenever we see a cap in a cap and trade program as somehow being assigned some numerical value of projections in emissions reductions, we need to see the backup on that because we see other modeling assumptions that contest that. So that's what I'm saying. Like, how can we be comfortable in a figure of 77% reduction if one of the modeling assumptions is something reasonable people can disagree whether in fact a cap like that will lead to emissions reduction. So just understand that if that is part of that calculation, it raises flags is all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I actually should say, now that I think about it, I'm not 100% sure that any of it is, because the TCI cap is only out to 2030, so I don't know that it is assumed to contribute anything to the 1990 level. I just don't know for sure. But you know, let me also say that, you know, all of this will be calculated again in the integration analysis. Is going to take place over the next several months, or next few months, I should say, along with, you know, a number of sort of variations on the policies here, and that's all going to be vetted with the council itself in you know, sort of a, you know, great deal of transparency.
And Eddie, just real quick, I'll also say that that was actually my unintentional omission. I didn't put that in there I didn't actually, I mean, as you know, there's 500 pages. Right. Had I known that that was in there, I would have definitely included it. Like, I don't, you know, so, and I think it will be crucial, given that, you know, this is such an important issue, that the feedback is conveyed to the Climate Action Council. So I'm certainly available to help discuss that, and I would like to when we have the chance. Let's go to the last slide so we can talk about the options. So I put out a couple of different options on how we can, how you can present. One is that each of you would present before the Climate Action Council, and the time that you have would be divided in equal proportion by the number who wish to speak. Another option is that everyone collaborates on one letter and you submit that to the council, and separately you also present before the council, and then as one collective, and then that format, you know, and the number of speakers is determined by all of you. Another option is that you present in self-selected groups, and then, you know, we could divide the amount of time that each group has by, you know, in equal parts by the number of groups. Another option is that we divide it into groups of 3, so that each group includes representation from an urban, suburban, and rural community. And, you know, in that case, we could also divide up the panel topics so that each of you can speak to a different panel topic. And in all cases, you know, you can submit written comments. You can do it as one collective. And certainly if there's maybe some parts that you all agree with, the collective letter can focus on that. And you can sign it in self-selected groups. And of course, you can do it as individuals. And I will collate all of your comments, and then we'll submit it to the council, I think as one document, but, you know, open to feedback on that. And the other thing is, like, just want to note again, I can, you know, help you with research, creation of materials. And as we, you know, probably won't have time to like go deeply into this, I'll share a poll with each of you to understand your preferences. And then, you know, and then anything you want to communicate to the rest of your fellow members, I can also get that information out there. I think we have probably till 2:20. So does anybody have any thoughts that they would like to share on this right now?
What's the timeline for this happening?
The meeting is, so the key thing is, like, the written stuff can be later, like, you know, over the summer if necessary. The verbal feedback would need to be done at the June 8 meeting, and I think, like, we're 95% sure the meeting is going to be on June 8. So that's when verbal presentation would be needed. And the timing, to my understanding of how much time will be available, I think that's still TBD, and that could potentially also be dependent on how many people would like to present.
So I'm just trying to understand the process. So between now and June 8th, all of the working group members need to digest the information that's being given to us today, put into the SharePoint. And then somehow we're going to need to coalesce around these issue areas to possibly come up with some joint thoughts and recommendations or response.
Yes, but I would definitely look at, I know it is like a huge volume of stuff to look through. So I think you could also, if you really have limited time, you could look at just the summary that I provided, and then just look at the beginning parts of each slide deck, which should give you a really good sense of what's in there. I don't think that may not be the most challenging part. I think, certainly the most challenging part is going to be to decide how to offer the feedback. And I can, in checking in with each of you, I can kind of get your sense of that. And if it becomes apparent that there is broad agreement on a couple of things, or that the group wants to convey something, then we can move forward on that. And as I mentioned, I'm totally available to help with whatever is needed, including drafting, if that's helpful. And you don't have to do that. I think an easy option too is just to look at it and offer your own thoughts. And I did try to provide some guidance on how to do that. I think that you don't have to be super specific. You can kind of keep it broad too, like what input you provide. So I think that could be a surmountable challenge, even though I realize it can seem overwhelming.
So Samir, of these suggestions, the dividing into 3 groups, I think is the one that jumps out at me, mainly because although I would love to go through all of these in gross detail, based on the 2 that I've looked at so far, and the pretty major time commitment that was, I don't know that kind of for all of us collectively, it's going to be practical for everyone to go through everything. But I do imagine that if we kind of divide and conquer, we could produce some good results. And the idea of combining urban, suburban, and rural perspectives in each of those groups, I also think makes some sense.
Yep, and that actually reflected my thinking in that. So good to know that that's where you're also at. See how others feel. And we will continue to visit this. So I'll follow up with each of you over email on this, and we will come up with a good way to do this and to make sure that your perspective is conveyed.
Thanks, Samir. And Jared just dropped something into the chat that I think is an important thing to keep in mind about how the council should be assessing the recs in terms of impact and the significance to disadvantaged communities as you all are working to identify those communities. All right, so there was a lot to consider in the packets you received, and we fully recognize that. We wanted to give you all an opportunity to think about how you wanted to work together or provide your own recommendations, things like that. Definitely something we can follow up on as next steps. Does everyone feel like taking another quick break, or do you want to roll into the last portion of the agenda today, with Alex and Amanda.
Can I ask one other quick question about, kind of what options might be here? And this kind of gets back to what Eddie was talking about earlier in terms of maybe in some of these, recommendations that all of the perspectives and voices didn't get equal weight. I wonder if, and Samir, I'm sort of asking you if this is something you might be able to help coordinate. Can we schedule opportunities to talk to people, again, kind of not in an official setting like this, but outside of these meetings, about their experience through the process and what things they would want to flag that maybe didn't even make it into the materials that we've been presented, if that makes sense.
So I think you're asking if there's other opportunities to engage with the panel members again, specifically. That's something we'd have to, that's something we can take back and figure out. I know the June 8th timeline seems challenging because of the amount of recommendations, and I do really want to point out that the council wants to engage with you all based on your expertise and your experiences and the communities you represent, and that's definitely something I think would be helpful on June 8th, and there's other opportunities to weigh in on the specifics. So let me get back to you all very quickly on the possibility of re-engaging with specific panel members. All right, any other questions? Okay, so the next part of our agenda, we're turning to Alex. I did ask if you all wanted to take another quick break. Happy to keep rolling through if you all are up to it. Okay, great. So Alex, I believe you'd like me to turn the presentation mode over to you.
Yes, please.
Alana, can you pass the ball to Alex, please?
Woo! I've got the ball. Let's see if I can do this. Make it work. Okay. Share this screen. You guys are going to see everything. Okay, but I can't see you. Can you see my screen? Nope, not yet.
Not yet.
Share this screen. Okay. Now, can you see all the things? Basically, the presentation.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. Good. Cool. I don't know what's going on with my internet, so I apologize if things go a little crazy. But okay, we have gotten through a lot, and we have, another half hour to go. But I deliberately made this light, and so here, and I'm also staying out of presentation mode just to make my life easier. Here's your map present for the day. How can I say this other than we're going to look at maps today? I want to give you a bit of an update. We're getting so much closer. We still have some critical things to do, but considering everything that we've talked about so far, I just wanted to give you all a chance to see where we're at and get some thoughts from you on the maps and what information we're providing, and get some ideas of if there's any other information you'd like as you assess things. So please, as always, let me know if you have questions. As far as status of where we're at, we have moved down this line in the developing part. We're testing and iterating and optimizing. The reason for that is that we're still getting some critical indicators, so we're still waiting for the GIS transformations of those. But we do have pretty good proxies of them, so that makes me happy. We have some things that are looking okay. And that means that we can show you some more in-depth maps. And as we're building the tool, as we get these data in here, so we're not quite ready to like roll out a map for you all to investigate and tinker with, but I wanted to show you the elements of it. I also wanted to kind of give another shout out for the, as Abby put it, crazy amount of information in the scoring approach deck that we put out. In no way do we expect you to have to review and try to understand all the things in that deck, but it is a good reference of all the things in our brains that we're worried about and thinking about and trying to put things together. It also gives you a little bit of a primer, if you haven't done the ground truthing yet, on how to traverse the map that you do have to tinker with. But today, we're actually not going to talk huge detail about the approach and the things that we're tinkering with, and more just kind of show you some, again, the map that they're there. Did want to give a couple background pieces before we go there. The first one is, we're still functioning under this idea of burdens and vulnerabilities. And underneath those, we've kind of created these 3 per larger bucket factors. And these may shift depending on the indicators we end up selecting. But the idea here is that we're getting at pollution exposures, land use, disinvestments, climate change risks for the burden side. From the vulnerability side, we've got sociodemographics, health impacts, and then housing and mobility. Those are the kind of factors that we are finding to be helpful and useful. And so these you will see as we start kind of going through the maps, that you'll see these different elements. You'll see numbers for each of these. And I am hoping that as we kind of go through these, you'll start to get a sense for how these numbers change depending on what census tract we're looking at. I got you with me all so far. Can't see you, so I'm hoping that someone will just say yes, no, ask questions as you go. Okay, I'm just going to take silence. So again, this is an early map to get kind of your reactions to things. The maps now look like this. You can zoom into a specific area. Thanks to the little tutorial session, we learned that a lot of you would like to see the satellite imagery underneath it. So we put that into the map so you can actually start seeing what different areas look like. The orange shaded regions are the ones that we are, at least with the scenario we have, those will change, are orange, and then the other ones are white. And then we've got some tables on the right, and then if you hover over a census tract, you'll see this like little box that hovers over it. What I want to do is go through the different elements and what they mean for each of these, and then we will start tinkering, and you guys can shout out places, and we'll look at it in Tableau. So the table on the right side of the map have 3 different kind of tables in it. And we find these very useful when we're looking at and tinkering and say we take this indicator out, or we weight something this way, or we shift things around a little bit to see how the DACs are falling. And so we have this basically, and because there's a lot of percentages and a lot of numbers in here, we wanted to give you a primer of what these really mean. So in this case, this percent of tracts in a region that are DACs, we have here, you've got 33% of all census tracts that are designated a DAC. But then it also tells you within a certain region what the percentages are. So if I look at this number right here for the capital region, 24% of tracts in that capital region are DACs. That means for New York City, 42% of census tracts in the New York City area are designated a DAC with this scenario. And the reason why these are important is that these will change if we tinker with something in a scenario. And so then that kind of gives us these as like diagnostic tools.
Alex, it's Eddie, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
I'm just curious. So I'm looking at that table. It says percentage of tracts that are DACs, right? If the grand total is 33%, am I reading that 33% of the entire population of New York State are in DACs, or?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like it seems counterintuitive because I thought that the percentage of people of color in New York State is over 40%, which would mean that it seems like we're undercounting. So could you help me? I'm sure the problem is on my end, but if people of color population is 40%, why would the DAX be 33%?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one is that people of color are not evenly distributed across all the different census tracts in New York State. And so when you're looking at the census tracts in New York State, you're going to be covering a huge proportion of the BIPOC population. Now, I would say this, these are all of these different kind of pieces of information. And in this case, Eddie, I'm going to show you right here. If you go to the percent BIPOC, and again, we're using imperfect metrics. So I just want to say that this is a quick, rough tool and that we want to be thinking about race and ethnicity in the long term in a much more nuanced way. So I'm going to say that now. So, but I do think this is useful, right? So one of the things that you can look at is the breakdown of the percent of the BIPOC kind of population within each DAC, in the grand total 44%. So you're totally on that, right, Eddie? Within a DAC designation, that jumps up to 65, so well, basically 66%. Non-DAC designation is 34%. So you are seeing that being a pretty big thing and a shift in that. So that's definitely being covered. And we'll show you over the hover over, you can see income in there too. We're going to add that. You can also see other metrics that we're trying to make sure that we get. In this case, the redlining score for those census tracts where we have those data. I'm looking at that pretty critically because it's a really useful element for us to be a diagnostic tool, basically. We can't use it as a predictor in the model because not every census tract has it. But when we do have it, it's a really fabulous tool to look at. So what you're seeing, Eddie, totally right, in the sense that you've got 33% of DACs across the whole New York State. And then you've got, but a larger concentration of DACs have a larger percent of BIPOC population within this scenario. And then you also have things where you have a higher redlining score, you have a higher, and if you go down the average burden, you know, the pollution, disinvestment, climate, those are the factors I mentioned earlier. Health, sociodemographics, housing, all of those are higher on the DAC designated side as opposed to the non-DAC designated side. Don't worry about the numbers. These are actually going to shift. We're trying to get at a better set of numbers for you all to look at for those, like I'm making it percentile rather than what it is now. But what's most important here is to just start seeing how these switch. When we give you this tool eventually, we're going to let you toggle things on and off. We're going to give you different scenarios. And in which case, these diagnostic tables end up being really, really vital because this is what, like the first flush of things you're going to look at and be like, does this feel right to me? In addition to your ground truthing.
Alex, one more question. So thanks so much for the explanation. It's all becoming clear now. Thank you. But I did have a question. If I'm reading right, for the climate burden for non-DACs, it seems higher than DACs. Is the climate burden or the indicators that feed into that? All the indicators that we had been talking about, sea level rise. I'm just curious, like what went into that calculus? And just a couple of examples of climate, so that it seems to skew climate vulnerability higher for non-DACs than DACs. So I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I mean, because this is like what we did for this presentation was this unweighted thing. So there's actually kind of a funky element here. We've got a certain number of indicators within climate. And I don't remember exactly which ones they are. I'm sure Amanda does. And what that is telling me right here is that there's actually some places that have some, storm surge, other things like that are present for some places. I'm thinking in parts of Long Island here that are not present in other places. But that actually makes me kind of happy in some ways, you know, and this is one of those things we'll have to tinker with. The difference might not be that big between 48 and 45. That's why we want to make these numbers more meaningful, eventually. Amanda, you want to go?
Sure. I mean, I think it's just saying that, you know, some of the climate indicators might be at odds with some of the other indicators. And because, you know, they're just one of 6 things, big categories, and then there's details within, they're really getting kind of outweighed by a lot of these other factors. Yeah, and as Alex said, always the caveat that we don't quite have the final climate indicators we want in here yet.
Yeah, we're frankly still waiting on those, Eddie.
Thank you.
But I do think, you know, this speaks to last time we met, we were talking about making sure that some of the things like health, sorry, not health, income, sociodemographic, different indicators are weighing, you know, have a lot of weight and don't overflow everything else. So you might be seeing some of that, as Amanda said. Last table on the diagnostic part is the DAC designation region. One of the nice things about this is it kind of lets you see the breakdown of all the DACs across. So you can compare, okay, well, the Western New York has 7% of all the DACs in the state, or sorry, the 7% of census tracts in the state. They have 8% of the DACs in the state. And it's just a kind of okay, there's a higher propensity for census tracts in New York City to be designated a DAC than they have as far as, you know, the number of census tracts overall. And it just gives me, when I'm looking at this, going like, oh, okay, well, Long Island's got 4% of DAC tracts, but 12% of them overall. Does that feel right or not? And it also gives you a sense of relative distribution, because we want to make sure that we're capturing DACs across all regions on some level. So again, diagnostic tools, these numbers will change as we tinker with things. And that's the whole point. It's kind of like, okay, we do this one little toggle, we change one little thing. How does that make the map look? How do these numbers change? Does it feel right or not? Any questions? Because it's a lot of stuff. Okay, more stuff. Woohoo! We also have something that when you're in the map, you can hover over a census tract. So in this case, you know, like I hovered over this one specific census tract, and it gives me this information. And what's nice is then I can hover over a different one and be like, oh, well, the median income for the next one, the non-orange part, is much higher, and the percent BIPOC is much lower. So it makes sense to me why this one would be considered a DAC versus the other one. But it also gives you a chance to really see where things are shifting. The burden score as opposed to the vulnerability score, the redlining score, median income. These are diagnostic tools that we're using, I think, to really give you a sense of what's there. I'm just pausing. One of the things I was going to ask as we traverse this is to really think, oh, I really wish I knew, or when I was hovering over things, I wish I knew I had this piece of information. So as we go through this, basically like a demo of what we're building for you to assess and look at the scenarios, think about what else would be informative for you in this situation. And we will add it if we can. Okay.
Alex, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
If you're hovering over and you don't see anything, what does that mean?
Well, so if you hover over the table that you're looking for the ground truthing, you're not going to see anything other than census tract. But in the one that I'm going to show you, you'll hover over and it will show you stuff unless there's missing data.
Oh, okay. So it's not that.
No, you're not going crazy. We haven't published this yet because we're still literally building the tool. Like yesterday, we're like, okay, we need to add this. In this way, it's like building the ship as we go. You are not crazy, Amy. It's all good.
Well, I might be, but it's a separate story.
It's okay. We'll all go crazy together as we do this map thing. None of this is simple. Okay. Now, going to the next slide. So the thing about the map is when you first see it, you're going to see all of New York and it's be like, oh my gosh, I can't see a thing. But you can actually zoom in pretty closely and you can keep zooming in. And part of the tutorial we had, I think it was last week or the week before, we went through how to do that. I'm going to show you a little bit of that now as well. But you can drill down really, really in depth to see certain places. And then you can hover over and see the tooltip. Amy, to your point, you see I've hovered over this one part and the median income is 108. The red line score is missing. And again, this is to your point, there are some missing data in this diagnostic. The red line score in particular is going to have a lot of missing data. So if you don't see data in this new version when you get it, it's because it's just not present in our data set. Okay. So as I mentioned before, as we go through this example, and the next thing we're going to do is go to Tableau and tinker with it. I really would love to get your sense of like, what else do you want to know as you're looking through these different pieces of information? Because there are going to be things that we're going to ask you to do, which is like, okay, well, in this situation, we've combined things this way. Again, hearkening back to the idea of look at that crazy deck that has all the approach things we're doing. We're going to be creating some scenarios that will let you tinker with some of those things. So you can be like, oh, that combination of we multiply the scores and make the vulnerability score worth twice as much. Fine. And then that gives you this breakdown as opposed to the other. So what information, what diagnostic information would be most useful either in these tables or in this hover over thing that would help you see whether something's a DAC or not and really assess it? So that's just a question to keep in the back of your mind. You all ready? Okay, we're going to do this thing. Here is the beautiful Tableau. I told you we're going to this crazy, crazy map. Would anyone like to shout out an area they want to look at, and then we can talk through how to look through things and what you think of this current unweighted, imperfect, still building it scenario that we have? Oh, come on, someone.
I won't be shy. Let's go to Rochester.
Okay, Rochester it is. So I've typed in Rochester. And woo! Crazy times here. There's a lot of things. And I still can't quite tell what's what. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more to
So
do
I
that.
can do exactly what I want to see.
Yeah.
You see the gray, like missing puzzle piece in the kind of the bottom.
These guys?
Yeah, I was surprised that some of
Yeah.
like that.
So,
yeah, like 90% BIPOC and 37,000 median income. That seems weird to me.
yeah, this seems weird to me too. Again, imperfect thing. So let's figure out, let's look through and be like, okay, what makes the burden score is 33, the vulnerability score is 67. What made this one so different from, say, this one right here? Okay, the burden score here is 40, the vulnerability score is 76. The redlining score is 3, median income is 26, percent BIPOC is 92. So if I go down, slightly higher income, 10 by 10,000, redlining score is the same. Burden score, so those are the environmental indicators, that's lower.
Can you compare, can I give you a specific area to compare it to?
Totally.
Okay, you see, all right, move.
Hold on, let me just zoom in a little bit more so that you can see a little bit more detail. Because sometimes you just gotta see the neighborhood.
Okay, all right, so see where you are right now, go, not where you are right now. Okay, move to the right and up to that one that's
right here.
Nope, nope, to the right.
This one?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So
why on earth is that a DAC and the other one is not? That makes no sense.
It doesn't. So this is where I think what we need from you is to be like, that makes no sense. And and to be clear, I think this is one of the things that we don't talk about enough in statistics and in these things. Like, we have built all of this stuff based on theory so far. Like, we've talked to all the scientists, we've looked at what California did, we looked at what other regions have done, we've built this thing out, and we still have a lot of tweaking to do, but that tweaking needs to depend on, Abby, your exact thing right here, being like, this tract right here, 36055003400 should not be a DAC, as opposed to this guy right here should.
I see another one. Ooh.
Okay.
Alex, you see there's like all the way to the right, there's a brown chunk. Yeah. Like literally mansions in that neighborhood.
Okay. Yeah. So when we release this to you, this is exactly what I want to be like, you're so wrong, Alex. Dude, that should not be in there. And then what we need to do on the back end is get our brains together and figure out what it is about the special recipe of the 40 odd indicators we have and the weights we've given them and the way that we've combined them that makes this a DAC and not the other one. Because these scores are lower than this score.
Well, the burden score, I think it's really getting back to the burden score. And right now, kind of burdens and vulnerabilities are equally weighted. So I think we're seeing that areas with relatively higher burdens are coming out. But yeah, I mean, this is not, it's not for you to, solve exactly how we change the formula, but rather to say, this is surprising to me. Here's what I know here. And then we take all of that and kind of reassess how the scoring works and how the combination of things works.
Cool. Thanks.
To that end, like, I'm going to drive you guys crazy and do something I probably shouldn't do, but I'm going to do it anyway. Over here, I'm going to change the weight of a few things and hopefully it won't kill the whole process. We're building some of these toggles for you to tinker with as well so that you can see the differences. But let's see whether if we make this more important relatively to the other things, whether that shifts. So now it's going to shift things. Come on, recalculate. Slowly working through it. Look at that. That one went away. And this one got added. But this one isn't. But that's okay. Does that make sense?
So yeah, every time you identify tracks like that, we can add them to our ground truthing list. And as we start to build a better sense, there's 4,918 census tracts in New York. And so there's no way we can possibly do our own analysis or ask you to catalog every single one of them. But as we start to build out this list of things that should and shouldn't be, that can become one of the benchmarks as well. So over on the right, then you would see, we could show something like, how does this scenario align with a ground truth track? So we can start to optimize the scoring to better align with, those areas that you've weighed in on specifically.
I have a question, Alex and Amanda. This is Saul. Can you talk a little bit about what's the sort of value difference of like a weight of 1 versus a weight of 2?
Yeah. So mathematically speaking, like if you take these clumps, and I should say that this is going to change a lot. So we have to figure out. Right now we have for these different indicators. So I'm pointing at a table that I didn't go through with you before because it's gonna change. But say over here for burden number 2, disinvestment, we have 11 indicators in that. We have quite a few things that we're trying to show in there. Those all get added together and then it becomes basically one score. So if you take these 3 things for burdens 1, 2, and 3, they get added together. The vulnerabilities get added together or averaged, I forget, Amanda. And then it basically right now, if you have everything as a 1, it just basically says, well, vulnerability health is just as important as sociodemographics, just as important as disinvestment, these different factors that we have. If I go and I say, hey, I'm going to make sociodemographics a 2 instead of a 1, I'm making that count as like 2 of that vulnerability score. So it takes up more space. If you're going to think of it in a non-statistical way, it's just taking up more space within the score.
So you're actually like doubling its value versus like, because I'm wondering, I'm like, what if I put it as a weight of 5? You know, what's the difference in terms of
well, let's do
like
it.
a 2 and a 5?
Again, all this stuff's going to change it, but this is the tinkering that we're trying to do, and frankly, this is why having your feedback about like this doesn't look right is so important, because all of these little behind the scenes tinkering things make it so that we can make it fit the truth that you live in, as opposed to what I worry about sometimes, which is if you just do theory, like we've got the theory down, that's great. But if we don't do this bottom up, like looking at it from the lived experience that you all have, it's not going to be optimized. It's not going to be right in the way that we need it to be right for you all. So Sonal here, yeah, it just changed things again. It added another deck over here. Remember? Still missing this guy. That's fine.
Well, so question, the disinvestment one that, you know, there are 11 criteria. What's the historical time frame of that? Like,
yeah.
Because I'm looking at specifically my neighborhood that I think way back when, yes, there was disinvestment. Right now, not so much so. So I'm wondering if maybe that one is overweighted. And so I don't know if it's specifically the red line score that's kind of on this maybe.
Well, the red line score does not factor into any of the scores that you're seeing. It's just a diagnostic tool. So we've got like some things that we're using as a part of the predictor, like the creator of the DAX, and some things that we're just looking at to be like, oh yeah, that's important. And we should kind of compare our brain sense of what this is to that. Again, because we don't have the lived experience of, say, your neighborhood, right? So for me, the redlining scores within cities is really important. We don't have those data for everything else, so it's not skewing things in this case. But yeah, other things could be. The disinvestment is more on a climate side. Should I go here?
Oh, it's it's proximity to potentially hazardous or previously hazardous facilities, like hazardous waste remediation sites, chemical sites. It's all of the land use variables, like whether things are classified, whether the actual land use in zoning terms is classified industrial, manufacturing, utility, waste, or transportation. It does have the redlining score and it has a vacancy. But I want to caveat that in this version, I think this is the area where there's the most work to do on getting additional variables and pulling in DEC data. But also, I think for an observation like that, I think what we'd want to hear there is like, what are the features in your neighborhood that you think do or do not represent historical discrimination? Because we also need to figure out like what the right indicators are. Like if you think of a neighborhood and you think this area has experienced discrimination or disinvestment, we want to know what types of facilities you're thinking about so we can kind of think of whether our data covers the types of facilities you have in mind.
Abby, two things I misspoke. When I think of burdens, I think of environmental, not climate. So burdens environmental, which tells me all of these different parts. And also we do seem to have in this scenario, the red line score for part of this as well, which we may take out depending on what information we have. But to Amanda's point, all of these, I mean, a lot of these are going to be updated. Again, we have good enough versus not perfect. But this gives you a sense, and when we give you this tool, we're going to have basically what we hope to have, if we can manage to build it in this tool, is a way for you to be like, well, what would happen if I took benzene out in this case? What would happen if I added in another thing that we deem is okay? And then But not just that, then you kind of go back to what we were tinkering with, which is, well, what would happen if I make sociodemographics more important within the vulnerability score? So many toggles that we can tinker with here.
Alex?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, this is exactly, yeah, this is both enlightening and troubling at the same time, because I like, for example, if we, how do we toggle weights to achieve what we think is the right outcome for a particular census tract and do so in a way that's not arbitrary, right? Like,
oh yeah.
I just, for example, like when I'm only now seeing the orange versus not orange. When I was doing my ground truthing earlier, I didn't look to see whether those parts that I was designating as DACs were in fact recognized as such on the map.
Well, they're not in that map. In the ground truthing, we haven't
okay.
shown you any of this yet because it's not real yet. We haven't built it all yet. So what I'm showing you right now is imperfect. To your larger point, Eddie, of the whole, like, it's scary to think that you can tinker with data so much that you can make it as arbitrary as you want. That's part of why we want to be so transparent of the fact that you can do that, because people aren't. And it drives me batty, as you all have known for a while now. And I think in this case, like, we just need to be transparent and also theoretically grounded as well, right? So like, I want, and we have gone that theoretical grounding of this matters. We know this matters. We know this from all these studies, from everything else that we know in our lived experience. But we also know, because you live in the neighborhood or you know the place, that this is legitimately a DAC. So how do we make sure that it is a valid, very grounded way of building something like this? I don't want to build something where me as this Oregonian comes in and says, look, Rochester, this is because they have this, right? Like, this conversation we're having now, that where Abby was like, dude, no, this should not be a DAC, is very telling to me, because it helps us see, oh yeah, this is more important. We need to figure out a way and show basically in the data, what is that lived experience, that the sociodemographics matter more.
Right, and one last thing about this, and folks have touched on this earlier, I think, but I don't know, I don't even know how to process or how to fix a DAC or non-DAC designation for a community that I think Abby was talking about this, where clearly there was disinvestment up until a certain time, and then what's happened since then is, hyper gentrification, right? So a community could look like it was disinvested, but still be, market rate, majority white community that's gentrified this particular area in the last 20 years, 10, 20 years. So it's yeah, this is raising all kinds of flags for me. So thank you for this. Appreciate it.
Right. So this is where, now that you're feeling those flags, the deck, that crazy deck with all the, whoa, this is overwhelming stuff. That's why we've been thinking about all those things, so that we make sure that we're not overwhelming it. I want to say one more thing, and then I think Amanda wants to talk. And that is that I don't want you guys to worry about the weights and the individual things there. Like, that's our job to do. What I really want is to hear, this is clearly not a DAC, this is why, and then asking those critical questions of what is it that really matters to you and why in your neighborhood, Abby, that you see this and you don't think it is a DAC, or you do think it is a DAC, because that then informs us and tells us how to do this. And we will make sure, this is our promise to you, that we're doing something that's theoretically grounded, that's transparent, that can create the map that really is as accurate as possible with the data we have. Amanda?
Yeah, no, exactly that. I mean, these weights are here because we need to set them as something, but I think, as we've said before, we really, really don't want to go down a path of really fine tuning and having precise weights of 1.7 weighting is extremely subjective. And, California, for example, basically didn't do anything more complex than saying that one set of variables should be double another set of variables. So we don't really want to get to any solution that has complex weights and kind of, doing as little weighting as possible. That said, there's other tools we have, just the way that percentiles are added together, or the way that we once we have a score, what percentage of that score do we take? Do we take the top 25%, 33%? So there's a lot of things like weights happen to be what's, you know, visible on the screen now, but there's a lot of things we can play with. Yes, Alex said the more important thing is to say, you know, in this neighborhood, you know, it has these type of facilities, but not these type of facilities. This has been gentrified. This hasn't. This is high income. This has mansions, things like that. And then together we'll kind of collectively see what the, you know, all of those comments point to. Maybe overall they point to vulnerability should count for more, but we're not asking you to solve, you know, weight vulnerabilities more.
I know you all have to go. And I know I wanted to leave you with this, and that is that we just showed you like brain busting coolness, I hope, but also that there's so much more now that you see that we have to talk through. But we have the tool now that we're getting there to be able to talk through it and ground that. So I'd like to offer one-on-ones, tutorials, or small group reviews. We will be releasing a draft once we've built more of it out so that you can tinker with and assess more of it. That's still TBD. We're trying to get as much of the better data as possible as we do it. Rosa, on to you. Sorry for zooming through this past part.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, everyone. I'll just add further next steps that we will be reconnecting with you on the Climate Action Council engagement, on the investments and benefits, and we look forward to seeing everyone again at our next May meeting on the 24th. All right, take care. Thanks, everyone.